Hi, greetings everyone. I am Manik Esahak Biswas, a prominent social worker, climate change adaptation advocate, humanitarian professional. Today, we're diving straight into how climate change acts as a massive threat multiplier, literally a catalyst for global insecurity. You know, when we look at a cracked, dry Earth, it isn't just a symbol of failed crops. It's actually a physical representation of the deep, systemic fractures that environmental degradation causes right within our societies. Simply put, when the land breaks down, the social fabric relying on it breaks right down with it. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is crystal clear on this. Climate change is a direct, urgent threat to human security. Because let's be honest, we all know it's not just about rising temperatures anymore, right? We're talking about the very real, immediate loss of livelihoods, the total depletion of essential everyday resources, and the forced migration of entire communities who are just trying to survive. So, in this explainer, we're going to unpack how hard, undeniable data can actually become our best weapon for accountability, for climate justice, and ultimately, global peacebuilding. Our main focus today is taking the information we already have about climate impacts and turning it into real, actionable pathways for peace. As you'll see, demanding justice is completely inextricably linked to maintaining security. Here's the roadmap for our explainer today. We're going to start by understanding this ultimate threat multiplier, then look at the human cost, define climate justice, see how data acts as a weapon, and finally look at building peace through resilience. Let's jump in. Section 1. The ultimate threat multiplier. Let's start by breaking down the cascade effect of environmental shocks. There is a very direct, literal path from a physical climate shock straight to armed conflict. It's like a domino effect. Think about the cascading situation in places like Somalia. You've got changing rainfall and protracted droughts that absolutely desolate agriculture. What happens next? That devastation forces communities to migrate just to survive. And then, as people move, the sudden spike in demand for already limited resources, like water and grazing land, sparks severe conflict. We're seeing this exact same pattern play out in Sudan and all across the Middle East, where severe water scarcity and desertification are just multiplying existing threats. The thing is, environmental pressures don't just exist in a vacuum. They actively tear at the seams of social cohesion. Get a load of this statistic. 19 out of the 25 most climate-vulnerable countries in the world are currently dealing with active conflict. 19 out of 25. Why is that? Well, when institutions are already weak or fractured by violence, they just don't have the capacity to respond to sudden environmental disasters. And when a state can't manage climate-induced resource shortages, it creates a massive vacuum. Unfortunately, that vacuum is often filled by non-state actors or extremist groups who are all too eager to exploit the desperation of the local population. Okay, moving to Section 2, the human cost of climate, let's look at how all of this builds into a deeply disproportionate crisis. Now, there is a stark, almost unbelievable injustice at the very heart of this crisis. The people facing the absolute harshest realities, they're the ones who did the least to actually cause the problem in the first place. The United Nations Human Rights Framework hammers on this point. The wealthy, highly industrialized systems that generated the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions are not the ones bearing the immediate catastrophic brunt of the fallout. Instead, that heavy burden is falling directly onto developing nations, the poor, our youth, and future generations. It's just a massive, glaring imbalance of cause and effect. According to UN human rights guidelines, specific vulnerable populations are taking the real hit here. They're suffering from compromised food security, wiped out livelihoods, and forced displacement. For instance, women and girls often face much higher risks, largely because they're typically the ones responsible for securing water and food in these vulnerable communities. Then you have indigenous peoples, who are watching their traditional lands and generations of deep ecological knowledge being threatened. And for small island developing states, guys, this isn't just about taking an economic hit. Rising sea levels are a literal existential threat to their exclusive economic zones and their very sovereignty. Which brings us to Section 3, defining climate justice. Because of these massive inequalities we just talked about, we absolutely must pivot to a human rights approach to solve them. So what does this actually look like? Well, climate justice isn't just an environmental issue. It is fundamentally about protecting human rights and ensuring the most vulnerable are not left behind when we talk about mitigation and adaptation. It essentially demands that the people unjustly suffering the harms of climate change become the primary beneficiaries of climate action. It's all about demanding that adaptation finance and loss and damage funds are handed out fairly, transparently, and directly to the specific communities that desperately need them to survive. The International Development Law Organization, or IDLO, identifies a few crucial elements to make transformative climate action happen. First, we have to empower vulnerable populations so they can actually realize their environmental rights. Second, we've got to strengthen institutional capacity so governments can actually respond when a crisis hits. And third, we need to drastically improve how we govern land and natural resources. Because without strong, people-centered institutions doing this work, the climate crisis is inevitably going to bring about way more inequality and a lot less peace. Let's move to Section 4, Data as a Weapon. How do we actually go about demanding this accountability? This is where things get really actionable. Arming highly vulnerable nations like Bangladesh, for example, with undeniable data essentially forces a global reckoning. The logic here is super clear. Step 1. Information proves the injustice. The raw data explicitly shows who caused the emissions versus who is stuck suffering the consequences. Step 2. By proving that injustice, we can secure the means for survival, specifically grant-based loss and damage funds. Step 3, those funds are used to build resilience. And finally, Step 4, that resilience prevents the displacement and resource conflict we were just talking about. The math is undeniable, really. Climate justice is peace building. So the major takeaway here is that climate data, it isn't just a bunch of boring statistics on a spreadsheet. It's a literal mechanism to secure the grant-based funds that are absolutely essential for survival. Vulnerable nations can completely lead the global campaign for climate justice and peace by taking their moral arguments and cementing them with hard, indisputable scientific and economic data. That is exactly how you hold the international community accountable. It's how you transition from being victims of climate change to being active, powerful agents of transformative climate action. All right, final section, Section 5, Building Peace Through Resilience. Let's see how all this theory translates into actionable resilience on the ground. Think about grassroots climate adaptation. For instance, when farmers in Burundi adopt shared inclusive irrigation systems, it directly generates collaboration and social cohesion. It's amazing to see. When we actually implement nature-based solutions and climate adaptation strategies properly, they do so much more than just solve an environmental problem. They actively bring communities together, they help restore trust across old divides, they cool down local resource disputes, and they foster real peace right at the most fundamental local level. When climate finance is allocated the right way, it funds these incredibly tangible pathways to resilience, and those pathways directly prevent the kind of resource scarcity that triggers conflict in the first place. We're talking about constructing physical infrastructure to hold back rising tides, implementing sustainable land management to save local farming, or diversifying economies so that a whole community isn't betting its survival on a single climate-vulnerable crop. These are the real-world investments that finally break the cycle of climate-induced violence. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought. We have the data. We clearly understand the threat multiplier effect. And we know for a fact that climate justice directly equates to peace building. The ball is in our court now. The choice is simply whether we act on this information to protect the most vulnerable among us or look the other way. Thank you for watching the video and inspiring us.